Okay. So standard disclosure notes, except congratulations to all those University of Michigan fans on their national championship last night. Uh, we have quite a few of them on the call today. So uh, 26 years and a really nice win. Today, I'd like to talk about the risks and opportunities for a disorderly world. And I think it's safe to say it feels quite disorderly these days. When you think about, as we start this year, the Bulls and the Bears have both put out their cases for how they see things evolving, and they're both pretty strong cases. From the Bulls side, it's the combination of the Fed pivot and either a soft landing or no landing for the U.S. economy. For the Bears, it's overbought conditions, it's stretched positioning, particularly with the FANGs. It's the overly aggressive Fed rate cut and earnings growth expectations and geopolitical tensions, including our election. So we have a pretty messy and disorderly world we're living in today. And Peter Drucker has said that in times of the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it's the way we act to that turbulence. And I think in using yesterday's logic, and I think the way we're seeing the world, I think you have to bring a very different approach to investing today that you did any time in the last 13 years. So today we want to take a quick look at the global economy and the US economy and then talk about these risks and opportunities. So it's fascinating when you look at how GDP has evolved. And I just went back to on world GDP, back to 2000, we were about 34 trillion of GDP. Fast forward to 2010, it got to about 67 trillion. And now we're closing in on $102 trillion and growing. And with all the problems that we've had over the last 10 to 15 years, the growth has really been pretty phenomenal. And that's a reflection of the policy support, both on the monetary side and the fiscal side, that's been going on, but also the tremendous innovations that we're experiencing in that time. And if you think about it, from 2000 forward, we didn't have the iPhone until 2007. So think about everything that's come since then. It's not a surprise we've had the big growth, but it is a bit of a surprise with all the challenges. If you look at the U.S. economy, and just to give you the same numbers, in 2000, the U.S. economy was about 10.4 trillion. In 2010, it was 15.3, and then hit 27, almost 28 trillion last year, and it's going to continue to move up this year. When you look at the debt, though, and this is a big part of the problem, and whether it's the U.S. debt or world debt, look at the move up in these numbers. And from 08, I'll go back to 2000, the U.S. had 5.6 trillion of debt in 2000 against a $10.4 trillion GDP. It grew to $14 trillion in 2010 against a $15 trillion GDP. And then it just passed $34 trillion a few days ago. It only took 72 days to go from 33 to 34 trillion in debt in the U.S. And interest payments now are roughly 35.7% of tax receipts. Think about that. More than a third of the tax receipts received are going to pay the interest on the national debt right now. And look at the last element of the U.S. economy that I wanted to highlight today is the deficit that we're running. And when you think about the world we're living in today, go back to World War II, you saw deficits of almost 27%. But at no time since then have we seen the depths that we've seen in 2020. And then even still where we are today is well below the historical norms by a pretty aggressive margin. So this is a big problem, and it's crowding out other spends. And I think this is going to be an issue that we're going to see around the world as one that we're going to have to wrestle with for some time. So let's jump into the risks and opportunities, and starting with the risks. And we've talked about these on previous calls. We have the shift from the left to the right. You have the battle between the democratic and autocratic nations. And then in the US, we have an election with two highly unpopular choices in historic terms. And they're doing that against elections against really strained government finances. I just showed the US deficit. Other deficits around the world are continuing to grow. One of the big risks is China and China's growth, and it screwed us up last year, and it threw me off. And at ARS, we thought they were going to use the old playbook. They really were more focused on which was growth for growth's sake, and they're really more focused on deleveraging and getting their debts in order. So where do they go? I want to talk about three areas coming up in more detail. China's growth, the battle for essential materials, and also what's going on in Europe. But these are the risks that are out there. The elections are a big one. So we know that now it's up to over 50 major nations and about 50% of the world's population and world's GDP are going to the polls this year. And the choices they make will be felt for quite some time. So I think this is an area that has massive opportunity for volatility, and it starts with Taiwan this week. And you're already starting to see the rumblings out of that. I talked about China and its growth prospects, and in one of the future briefings, I want to talk about this in more detail. But this is a really kind of staggering kind of a chart when you look at this and where things are going, and how does the China economic miracle play out. I don't think it's necessarily Japan, but I don't think they're going to be as quick to overtake the US as everyone thinks. I think it is leaning more towards the debt problem is going to take some time to work out of. And they have other issues, though, and it gets to their military readiness and all that. But this is a real change. And I think one of the big underlying factors here that really needs to be played out is it's easier to have a happy population when you're growing at 9 to 11% growth for 30 years. When that dream starts to fade and people start to struggle with the reality that they might not be grasping the great ring, then the question is, do you put up with political suppression and not have the economic advantages? And I think this is one of the great dilemmas that's going to be playing out over the next 10 to 30 years, quite frankly. And then the other issue is Europe, I believe, is at an inflection point. If it's not reaching it, it might already have reached it. And the competitive position is weakening. The energy challenges we know exist. They are leading in a lot of areas that are really interesting, such as the clean energy transition, their view of antitrust against big tech and kind of making the world better from that perspective. But what does it leave them with economically, and how hard is this transition going to be? And when you're going to the polls with as many people going to the polls right now, for the politicians to get elected, they're going to have to say the things that they need to do that are going to be very hard for them to deliver on financially. And I think this is one of the areas that's going to create a lot of risk and volatility in the markets over the next period of time. So there are other big risks growing, and I didn't get into the big wars and all that. But if I go back to this chart here, I do want to point out one thing. At any point in time, you can see big opportunities to make money. And if you want to go back in time, go back to this period of World War II. One of the things that was going on in the US at that time is the railroads were about to go bankrupt. And as the US started to gear up the war machine, they became one of the best investments that existed. So from bankruptcy to hugely successful investments in that time. Fast forward to the pandemic, we saw a lot of companies that got hit and rebounded. And I think when you think about where we are going forward, where we are today, with a disorderly world like we're talking about, I think the areas around energy, industrial materials that we'll touch on in a minute will give you opportunities to make money in a very sloppy and unsettling world. And I know a lot of families, when they see all the problems out there, they pull in the oars and they say, I don't want to be exposed in the markets, instead of saying, where should I be exposed? So I think this is a really interesting dilemma that we're going to be faced with this year. So where are the opportunities and how do we think about it moving forward? Obviously, tech, as we talked about for the last half hour, is one of the big areas. And semiconductors continue to be one of the key engines to drive the tech transition. The cloud is one of the big recipients, and we still think we're not as far along as the market likes to think we are around there. And then anyone driving the productivity boost that's going on is going to be a big beneficiary of that. And we think tech is one of the big key drivers for that. And it will flow through, instead of tech being the sector you want to invest in, it's going to be which companies are in all industries are doing the best to use technology to increase productivity. I think on the industrial side, the beneficiaries of the industrialization, climate change, and national security are clear. It's defense companies and other areas. But if you think about aerospace and defense as a weighting in the S&P, the aerospace and defense is only 3% of the S&P. Defense companies alone would be less than half of that. As I've mentioned in the past, you could buy in combined market cap the top 5 U.S. defense companies for under $600 billion today. rough or right around there. You can buy the top 5 steel companies, which we're coming to next, for about $52 billion today. So these are areas that are not overinvested. They're under appreciated by the market, and little moves can push these companies up and their profitability up massively. Industrial commodities is another area we see a lot of play in. Rare earths, China just announced last week they're restricting some of the technologies for refining of rare earths that they are really the dominant player on, which is going to make the non-Chinese rare earth producers much more valuable in our mind. Steel demand is going to continue to go up and steel pricing moves up. And copper, which has gotten a hit by the reopening of China and not reopening the way we thought it was going to over the last year, is now starting to find its footing and we think is poised for a nice move up. We think energy continues to be a big play, as we were talking about earlier, and I agree with Austin that we need to do more talk about the renewables because they got sliced pretty hard last year, but that doesn't mean they're out. I think it's just a question of the normal birthing that you go through of new industries, that they have the hype phase and they get to the reality phase, and then you see who the real winners and losers are. And I think we're moving quickly into those phases. And then lastly, it's healthcare and those lowering costs in that area. But I would also point out with the moves in bond yields and the volatility in bonds, high quality dividend payers with strong dividends and low growth are going to be an area that we can see a lot of success in going forward. So I want to just share with you a couple other charts and we'll go wrap it up here. But this is tech spending in the blue line as a percent of CapEx, and then overall CapEx. And it's now over 50% of the spend is tech driven, and we can continue to see that move up as companies substitute capital for labor. And this isn't about firing people. This is about dealing with the reality that they don't have the availability of labor or the skills to do the job. So they're actually putting more technologies in. And this is where the beauty of AI can come in and really provide some big support. It's not eliminating jobs, it's eliminating tasks. Over time, it may eliminate jobs, but in the near term, it's eliminating the tasks. So moving on, I talked about following the money in the past, and industrial policy is driving capital flows. We've talked about this quite a bit, but look at since the US started putting in some of the industrial policies that we talked about last week, look at the move up in construction spending in non-residential in the US. And this is really the return home of manufacturing and the reshoring and foreign direct investment coming back to the United States. A lot of it is policy driven, and it's pushing other countries to think about their industrial policies and can they save industry the way they need to, and can they afford to do it as we stand right now. I think a lot of countries would like to do this but can't afford to do it given the other demands on their limited budgets. And then the battle for critical resources. I don't know if you saw, but Norway just announced a big subsea mining initiative looking at rare earths and other critical resources. There is a big fight going on in the Arctic for who has the rights to those resources, and there'll be map discussions around that. But this transition to the low carbon economy is going to require massive amounts of energy and also massive amounts of industrial materials like steel and copper and rare earths. So big plays to be had here, but not a lot of opportunities to do that. And I mentioned the problems with the materials industry and the weightings of the defense industry. Materials are about 2.5% of the S&P weighting. And you think about what's going on, people are underinvested in these areas, and it won't take much to move them up. So the top 5 steel companies sell for about $60 billion right now, combined market cap. You go to the top 5 energy companies in the US, they sell for about $750 million, although that number is probably a little low because of the merger and acquisition activity. So maybe it's $1 trillion now, but it's still in the overall scheme of things, that's not that much. So a little money moving into these areas can produce massive returns, and we think that's been going on and will continue. I've talked about this chart, so I'm not going to go over it, but I do think we are struggling to adjust with the rising cost of living, and people are coming to grips with that. And it's not about inflation, it's about what's left after inflation declines, but the cost of everything you need to buy every day is still at a higher level. And how do we deal with that? I think those are the big issues. We are expecting that it'll be a bumpy ride, but we do see positive things for the markets and the economy. but this is going to be very much stock selectors market. And I think there are big opportunities, but it's time to drive carefully while you're being aggressive and moving towards your goals. So, Mark, I'll open it up for questions and comments.
Great, thank you, Steve. Yeah, just leave. Oh,
I'm happy to leave it for you.
yeah, it's fine. It's yeah, every 27 years. So, thank you, Stephen. Questions, comments?
Is anybody else not worried about the rising debt levels for the U.S. economy, debt service?
Yeah, the percentage of interest.
Yeah, it's a real issue, Joe, and it's not just the U.S. It's all over the world. We've and when you think about what transpired with the lost opportunity that governments had of zero interest rates for a decade, and now they're going to start making big investments at 5% or higher rates. It's almost malpractice what's been done around the world.
Have you guys run any models on kind of what the point of no return is?
Actually, we believe there is a point of no return, but we're not focused on that right now because we believe that the U.S. and other central banks will try and diffuse their way out of the debt again if they have to.
Oh,
the way we did it the last time, print money. You get your growth up higher than your debt levels, and that's what they're going to try and do. That's what they would likely try and do again.
So the other thing, though, is the 2017 tax cuts are going to be expiring soon. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because you can either print your way out of this to a certain extent, you can raise taxes, or you can cut spending. Those are really the three main things you can do.
Except the U.S. has very limited ability to actually cut spending the way we run our country. So I agree with you, Michael, that those are the things, the choices. And given those choices, I believe they will try and inflate their way out of the debt by printing money again.
So at the macro level, that's a problem.
Yep.
But for individual investors, it becomes, where do you pick your opportunities?
Yes. And who is not burdened by excessive debts that they can maybe making the investments that they need to make to substitute capital for labor to increase their productivity and grow their earnings, or get into new markets and grow that way. But when you have a period of excessive spending and excessive debts, you have to clear the deck somehow. And right now, the world's gotten to a place where they don't take the pain like we used to. We used to have normal business cycles, and we stopped doing that right now. So we have adjusted our approach to that and have artificial cycles right now. So I think that is an issue. And given the limited choices, I believe they would probably diffuse the debt by printing more money again, which is part of the game why they're trying to get their quantitative tightening to a level that would allow them, if they needed to print money again. Which is another area, Mark, I think is going to be an important topic coming forward. And you've started to hear some of the Fed governors and presidents coming out and talking about the liquidity in the system is not as excessive as it used to be. And if we are getting close to where we don't have enough liquidity, will they slow down or adjust their quantitative tightening process by lowering that, which would help in another area, because there is a concern that we might not have rates high enough to attract the demand we need to for our auctions. And some of the auctions have been a little squishy lately in terms of demand, which would mean if we don't get the demand for the auctions, we would have to raise the yields, which would further increase the debt problem. So I do think that's another area that we're going to be experiencing another new element to the system, which is the end of quantitative tightening or the reduction of quantitative tightening, which is running at 95 billion a month here. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
I'm looking at you, Bill, for some of that on that topic, but Adam, your hand's back up.
Yes, Stephen, thank you again for your presentation. Of the elections that the number of elections that are going to take place in the world, which would you consider to be the most important? And what's the impact on the global economy?
I think the U.S. and Taiwan are the two that are the most important. Clearly, I think the U.S. I mean, as troubling as that is, I'm not as concerned about the tax cuts going away, Michael. Maybe on the corporate side, but if I suspect that in the 2017 you would lose child tax credits, which would not be very popular if they eliminated all the things they're supposed to sunset. And I think that poison pill might, from the Republicans in there, might be enough to slow them down on that side. But I think the U.S. election is one, and particularly because of Trump's stated policies, if he's elected, would pull back support for a lot of the rest of the world. And I think that would probably have the biggest impact, particularly on Ukraine and what's going on in the Middle East. And that would open the door clearly for China to be more aggressive if that was the case. So I think that's the first one. But Taiwan's out of the blocks, and we'll know this week. And that is not, it looks like the pro non-Chinese group is in good position. So I think that's going to stir things up there a little bit. So I think those are the two big ones for me.
Thank you, Stephen.
I will say, though, that what's going on in Europe with all the different elections there and the shift to the right that is underway there is, I think, one that could be more troubling. It's not one election, it's the cumulative effect of those elections that could be very impactful too. On the whole future of Europe, for me, the European project, can it hold? I think is going to be under some pressure.
Would you say that's the biggest risk in 2024 of all the risks that you listed, the U.S. elections?
I think that'll change. I think it'll change throughout the year. So I'm not sure that one's more than the other. I think the biggest risk is more wars breaking out is the biggest risk to me. And that we have a couple hit at once, and then the West will not be able to support the people they're trying to support. I think that, to me, is the one in the back of my head is the biggest risk. What's the probability of that? I don't think it's high, but it's higher than I'd like it to be.
And I know, Jim, just a placeholder to talk about the congressional spending package. Jim?
Yeah, so we talk a lot about the national debt service. Stephen, I'm just interested in your thoughts about the strength of the consumer coming off the Christmas holiday. We're all kind of intoxicated by that kind of momentary spend. But I'm sure I'm not alone in realizing that costs like insurance is up double digits year over year. What do you think about the strength of the consumer and its impact on, pretty much everything?
I think you're going to have a real dilemma for the consumers in that the inflation numbers will continue to get better and they will feel it. And so I think that's a problem for the incumbents everywhere, that they're going to be viewed as not helping the consumer. I also think the consumer has been incredibly strong, and we're still at really ridiculously full employment levels, and that continues to foster the strength of the consumer. So you have on one side a really strong consumer with a pretty strong economy, not real strong but pretty strong, and you have on the other hand the cost of living increases that are real and permanent. Then the inflation changes, but cost of living doesn't change quite as much. It goes up, but it doesn't come back down. And I think we're adjusting to that. I think that's going to be a problem for a lot of households. They're going to start pulling back more spending. but not right away, not material. It'll be kind of a steady decline. The lower rates will help them though, and have taken a lot of pressure off the system. And we forget that we had you got to keep in mind, we had a 90 basis point move up and a 90 basis point move down very quickly.
You also talked about the kind of, I won't call it artificial, but the stimulus, right, on the heels of the pandemic that really kind of altered the data a little bit.
It altered the character of the economy, global economy and the U.S. economy for quite some time. So,
Michael Hammer?
Yeah, Stephen, you mentioned about capital investment versus hiring employees. But, and I just recently had a conversation with a friend who owns, I'll call it a small machine shop. He has 70 employees. Has been making capital investments, pays very well, but can't find the skilled employees to work these more sophisticated machines. So that's one issue is it takes time to train those people and they have to have certain skill sets. But then at the low end, in the local county seat here, they just opened a Dunkin' Donuts. And all the other fast food places in the area, starting wages were like $13 an hour, which a lot of the local less skilled people were complaining about. And then Dunkin' is offering $11 to $13 to start, when even the other places can't find employees starting at 13. And I scratch my head on that one. So I look at these sorts of things and I just go, I don't understand it.
well, I think in the case of a lot of the small manufacturing companies, our educational system is not designed to cultivate those skills. But it does cover Dunkin' Donuts, unfortunately. I think we need to get vocational programs back into the educational system so that people don't have the choice of only go to college to make a good living versus get a trade and get the skills so you don't spend the money on college and do those types of jobs. We've had an educational and training problem in the U.S. for quite some time, and that's what you're feeling in that. I don't think that's necessarily the pay rates. I think it's a skills issue that we have to change things in the educational system for. That won't happen overnight. I think Europe does a much better job in vocational training for younger people. We got to get back to that.
Other comments, questions?
Hey, Mark, can you hear me?
Yeah, I see it, right. Yep.
Colorado.
Hey, Rob.
Okay. Yep. Just Steve, just how does your numbers take into account the either the consulting types, the 1099 types that don't, on this last question on labor, that don't necessarily do the employment, but do things from sort of a contract basis?
I think that they would be listed as self-employed with the government, right? So they're in the rolls. You're saying they're not?
It's just some of these more services and tech-enabled labor, they don't want to identify, let's say, as a full employee of a company, but rather their own thing. And I just have seen some of the numbers. It's not clear in terms of the aggregate when a municipality claims job growth or what have you. Sometimes they include, sometimes they don't include. So I'm just curious as to how you guys look at that from a national.
We don't really focus on the squishiness of all the government reports because we're not trying to get to that level of specificity. We're really looking at the trends and the themes and the directional change rather than counting every angel on the head of a pin. That's not the way we're thinking about the world. That's really more for others. We do that when we're going into companies, but not when we're thinking about the macro environment. It's not worth spending the time that way for us.
Others?
Oh, I'm sorry, Stephen. If you could address one thing for me real quick is consumer debt. I just keep seeing it rising, and especially the non-housing debt, credit card debt, all that kind of stuff. It seems to me that's going to have a pretty substantial impact on the economy and could lead to some drastic problems. I'm just curious to get your take on that and how that fits in with the macro that you're talking about here.
It definitely is an issue. However, when people look at that, they're missing the other side of it, which is the personal disposable income has actually risen similarly. So then it becomes, are you one of the winners or losers in that? Really is where we are. But if you look at the numbers, household debt as a percentage of disposable income has actually dropped 3% from the 08 to now. So households are in slightly better financial shape. And if you think about it as a percent of disposable income, I think it's around $16 trillion or $13 trillion is disposable income. So 3% change on that is real money to the system. So you have to look at both sides of that. And you can't look at only one element. But I think when you go down to it, though, if you're on the wrong side of that equation, that's where the pain comes. And that's really the haves and have-nots economy that we've had as well. But I think you have to look at the growth side too. And that's why it's interesting when you see the GDP of the world, for all the problems we've had, growing 3% the last couple of years is probably where we've averaged for most of the world. It's actually pretty good, thinking what we've gotten hit with.
Yeah, but if you look at it, my understanding of it, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of it is that the have-nots are kind of all grouped toward the bottom, and they're the ones who are pursuing the buy now, pay later, and the now excess of $1 trillion of credit card debt. A lot of that's sitting with that lower have-not section. Are there any foreseen consequences if that does come to a head? It feels to me like people are hanging on to their 3% interest rates right now, which is why the housing debt and housing seems to be so low. That's just my personal take. I'm curious to get yours.
Well, mathematically, if you're looking to make investments and you have a 3% mortgage, why would you give up the 3% mortgage in a 5, 6, 7% world? So they're not going to swap that out, but that's actually healthy to have that level of debt because it's manageable debt for them. They're not going to get manageable debt now. I think what you're highlighting though is I don't think it's the low end consumer that's really, they spend most of what they have anyway because they don't make enough. They're not really big savers and they have challenges borrowing. I think it's the middle class that are really the area that it's losing ground. And that actually is a bigger issue of where you're getting these divergences in. And it changes by industry these days too. Think about what were the hot industries with the high paying jobs 10 years ago and think about what they are now. It's shifted some there too. So I think those are the elements. I'm sorry. But Matt, I think that's the difference. But it's not clear who's going to come out. I think in each group you'll see anyone over their skis is going to have a real issue in this environment. So it's too late to get your debt in order for most households with 5%. Same thing with governments, unfortunately.
Well,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Walter?
Yeah, congrats on the victory last night, Mark. And Stephen, thank you for the presentation. Quick question for you. Immigration, what kind of an impact are we going to see from this flow of immigration that's happening today into the United States? And if you could differentiate between legal immigration, because we do have 1 million legal immigrants coming into this country, and the illegal immigrants, and how's that going to impact the economy and potentially politically?
It's absolutely one of the hot buttons politically everywhere. Europe, it's a major issue, and it is here as well. I'll start with here. I think as much as people don't like what's going on with the immigration numbers, I think we need immigrants here in a healthy way, but in an orderly and controlled way. And we've gotten away from that. And I would actually have more immigrants coming in legally than we allow right now, and I would raise the H-1B visa numbers to much higher levels than exist today, and allow them to stay longer for longer periods of time after. On the illegal immigrant side, I think I am in favor of closing down the borders. I don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think it makes us bad people or unfeeling or an insensitive nation. I think it makes you a nation that's protecting your borders and protecting your people. So I think that's a good thing. How do you deal with the ones in here who are here already? I think it's very hard to throw them out now because they're already here. But I think you have to either decide you're going to bring them into the system or not. But you can't have them half in and half out. And then I would say when you get to the guys who are real criminals who come here as illegal immigrants, get a crime, they go back right away. So I would be, I'm all for increasing the numbers because I think that's important for the world economy to grow. I think it's going to be important for the U.S. economy to continue to grow, and I think it's really important for Europe to change their views on immigration, to be more open to it and more controlled. But I think we have to have a more controlled structure for that globally anyway. I don't know the number of forced displacements over the last couple of years, but it's alarming. It's, I think long term, I think the cumulative number is in the like 400 million displaced people we're dealing with worldwide. The UN has all these numbers. You can look them up. I'm off on that's probably an old number, but that's how I would look at it. I think economically, I think if you bring them into the system and start collecting taxes when we have tax problems, it would be probably helpful. So I think that you have to deal with the problem. They're here. You're not going to throw them all out. So address it by bringing them into the system and figuring out a way to do it. I think Germany has a pretty good model for dealing with large immigrants and large integrations. I think they spent $2 billion to get East Germany integrated. That was the budget I think they put out initially to bring East Germany into the fold. They were early, and I think it cost Merkel, was one of the reasons Merkel might have lost her job, was she was very aggressive on bringing immigrants in, and I think it was a good thing. I bet you if you looked at the numbers, she got more of the highly educated people getting into there because she was open to it early. I think you have to decide for your immigration policy, what do you need? What skills do you need? And put quotas to it and bring people in along all skill levels to do that, to move the economy forward. So I think a smart policy is necessary, and we don't have one.
We've talked about having a deep dive on immigration for a while.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to be involved with that, let me know. Michael?
So before I go into what I wanted to comment, Stephen, one of the things about Germany is they've done a much better job of integrating immigrants into German society than we have, or even other European countries. Language courses, requirements, stuff like that. But I just wanted to comment earlier, there was the discussion about folks at the lower end of the economic scale and credit card debt and other, how are they getting by? Last night, I ended up having a long phone conversation with somebody I know who's down in North Carolina, and he owns a farm, but he also owns about 40 or so rental properties, a mix of single family, duplexes, quads. And we were just kind of talking generally, and he made a comment because his mother was bragging to him, and he's in his 60s. His mother was bragging to him how she's getting 5% on CDs right now. And his response to her was, yeah, but with these rental properties, we're getting 5% a month on late payment fees. And so that's another interesting sort of thing, is when we look at, and that kind of grates on me personally, ethically, but he's counting on that 5% a month from a certain percentage of his tenants. So there's other places where, money is being extracted from people who are least likely to be able to afford it.
Yeah, you're right. We're in a tough situation. There's no two ways about it. And that requires that sort of thing you just mentioned, Michael, would require government involvement in some way to make sure that they're not being excessively abusive. And that's part of the challenge when you have the volatility we're having in the system today. And it's inequality is going to be with us for a while. And in the comments, Joseph, I agree with what you're saying. We've been losing the game for decades, and we continue to lose the education game. And until you win that, it's hard to get the bottom part of our economy back on track, because you can't do it by just throwing money at the problem. You have to give them up. You have to give them a quality of opportunity, not a quality of outcome. We can't afford a quality of outcome, so we're going to have to try and afford a quality of opportunity.
Other thoughts, questions?
I'll jump in with something different. As I've said before, I'm in the middle of the Utica and follow natural gas closely. And it's interesting because with the warm fall and early winter that we've had, natural gas prices have been really low. In recent weeks, just in the last, I want to say 10 days, it's moved up from about 250 to around 3, just above 3, which is still very low. But there's a lot of activity here in the Utica. They transitioned from moving the fracking sand in tanker trucks to what they call sandboxes that sit on lowboys, and they bring the sand. It comes on barges on the Ohio River because you need a special kind of sand, and then it's trucked to the various sites, the well pads that are being developed. There's a crazy amount of traffic of these trucks, which indicates that there's a lot of fracking activity going on, a lot of wells being developed, which implies to me that we will continue to see low natural gas, relatively low natural gas prices.
And I saw U.S. oil production at a new high.
Yes, it is.
I think that's a really interesting observation, Michael, because clearly, energy has been a big deal, and looking at Costco prices for gas, here in Florida, it's been going sub $3, on and off now for quite some time. The ripple effect, through the inflation process, that's very positive, as well. So it will be interesting to see, how sustainable. But I think that the resiliency of lower energy prices has proven to be remarkable, given everything that's been going on.
William, I can tell you, you're looking at sub $3 gas in Florida. You said,
Yes.
I just filled up 88 octane, so that's 15% ethanol max, $1.99 a gallon.
Holy smokes.
Yeah, Bill, I was just in Ohio. It's, I don't know. And I think we're at a new high on
That
production.
must have been a special, maybe like Sheets or somebody like that, because that's not the normal price for that.
Wasn't a special. I always look around to see which stations have the best prices. And you're seeing a lot of prices here around the $2 level, maybe more expensive, $2.20, $2.30, something like that.
And where are you exactly, Michael?
Call that Central East Ohio up to Northeast Ohio. So I bounce back and forth between our farm, and we have a home up by Cleveland.
Okay.
Are you by the Marathon refinery?
Not super close. They ship the oil that's produced here in the Utica. It's shipped by rail in tanker cars to that refinery and maybe a couple others in the general region. I think there's a refinery over by Whiting, Indiana, But we most of the production in this area is natural gas and natural gas liquids, not oil.
Yeah, it's interesting. Remembering back a ways back when I was an undergrad at Michigan during the last energy crisis, and Michigan as a state was pretty much didn't feel that because of a lot of the energy activity that goes on, which a lot of people don't talk about that much. But that's again, this is very interesting, and potentially connecting some dots on what's going on regionally.
Well, and then you
Globally, I'm sorry, Mark. I was just going to say globally, there's another element where the sanctions haven't worked to the degree that we thought they were, and they're being beaten pretty aggressively, which is also increasing the supply of energy into the global system and keeping prices somewhat lower than they normally would be if the sanctions were working.
Well, I'm hearing, Stephen, that they're working to a certain extent. I mean, basically they're taking, I don't know how many, $10, $20 per barrel away from Russia because they have to they're giving it away to India and others. But be that as it may, so we've talked about energy and big data earlier today, storage solutions, but I definitely see U.S. production, even what Eddie's about to bring on board, a $7 billion plant to go from natural gas to gasoline without refining. They want to do several of these plants, which has a combination of a reduction of carbon footprint and an increase of carbon from the U.S. For reasons I could explain later.
One other thing I'll throw in talking about energy is it looks like there's more interest in exploration and testing of the Trenton and Black River stratas here in Ohio, which is much deeper than the Utica.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just interesting. And one of the things I've heard from somebody that's in the industry, they're an inspector on well pad construction, so casings and doing that kind of testing, is that they're talking about as the production drops from the Utica wells on the horizontal legs, going deeper with the verticals to do horizontals in those lower strata. So that's really interesting from a cost efficiency perspective if that actually does get developed.
Yeah, I don't doubt there'll be more innovation, just as where fracking came out of. There was something else I was going to mention. Oh, I drove by. I must have seen 100 trucks, Ford trucks, and I'm told that they're sitting on the lot, Stephen, because they lack chips.
Yep. Still have a chip problem. We're working through it, but we're excited about the chip space for this year. We think we've already seen a pretty healthy move. We think it's going to continue to go. So